Most of our recent cases have involved people who were found somewhere off the Appalachian or a relatively nearby trail. In this case, however, we're talking about a kid who wasn't found at all. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Terror and joy walk the same ridges and coves of the Great Smokies. Flame azalea offers vivid color splashes amongst the greenery of the forested slopes that reach up to Spence Field. Knife-edged ridges are roan with rhododendron bloom, lovely from a high hill or from a hovering helicopter. A doe pauses beside the Appalachian Trail west of Spence Field and looks for a second at approaching hikers, before she bounds into the wet green wilderness that swallows her in a twinkling. Joy for the veteran wilderness lover, who knows where he is. Terror for a little boy like Dennis Martin, lost and hungry. Those are the words of Carson Brewer, a journalist and one of those closely following the search for 7-year-old Dennis Martin, who was lost in the wilds of the Great Smoky Mountains over Father's Day weekend in 1969. The location where Dennis was last seen is a grassy spot atop the ridge which forms the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, a place known as Spence Field, and of that area, Brewer had more to say. Only a true mountain man can love the Great Smokies when a cold dawn wind drives mist so thick that it beads like rain on his skin. Trails that are uncomplicated become baffling puzzles to someone new to the area. This is particularly true of the trails around Spence Field, where Dennis Martin became lost from his father, brother, and grandfather. Dennis's grandfather, Clyde Martin, and his great-uncles J. Hughes, Robert J., and Doyle Martin remembered the Spence Field when cattle grazed on it more than 30 years ago. It was less of a puzzle then. There were no trees on it, and cattle and sheep kept the grass cropped this short, said J. Hughes Martin, measuring 2 inches on a forefinger. The wild grass is ankle-high now, and weeds reach the knees. Clumps of serviceberry trees, laurel and rhododendron, and other low trees and shrubs grow on the field. So do thick patches of blackberry. They obscure the view. Some of the trails that snake through the tall grass are no more than 6-inch paths that might look like no trail at all to a confused boy. The Appalachian Trail crosses the field, generally in an east-west direction, but paths lead down from it to 2 trail shelters. Another leads down toward Cades Cove. One wriggles down the hill from one of the shelters into the Eagle Creek Valley of North Carolina. Another takes off down Jenkins Ridge, also on the Carolina side. Once Dennis Martin lost his sense of direction, one of these trails probably looked pretty much like the others to him, and he went the wrong way. It's a tragic story, one of a little boy who simply became lost in the wilds of Appalachia. But not everybody who has studied these events agrees with that narrative. Incoherent timelines, the presence of elite military units, FBI involvement, and tales of wild men living in the undergrowth have contributed to an air of mystery which surrounds this case. A case which some might call the ultimate missing 411 disappearance. But before I talk to you about how Dennis Martin got lost in the wilderness, I want to tell you about how you can get lost from the internet intentionally through our sponsor, Delete Me. We've talked about Delete Me in a few different videos and explained why they do what they do, and I speak to this from a position of experience, having worked in the marketing field prior to becoming a content creator. I worked in digital marketing, and what I can tell you firsthand is I had a lot of lists with a lot of people's names, addresses, phone numbers, whether they were on Medicare or not, all sorts of details that you would never really expect a random person sitting in an office somewhere to have. The way that we would get that information in the marketing world was by going and buying it from data brokers. Every time you enter a name, a date of birth, an email address, basically any little bit of information that could help somebody contact you and tell them what you may want or not want to buy, well, that information gets saved, stored, and then sold to somebody. That's a big reason why you're getting so many spam calls and emails clogging up your inboxes. And the biggest problem is that if you want to get all of that information off the web, if you want this to stop, you have to go and file claims with each and every one of hundreds of data brokers. And then those data brokers, what they're gonna do is they're gonna say, oh, sorry, we'll take it down, then it'll be a 30 or 60 day process, and then 2 months later, it's right back up there because they took it down, they didn't get rid of it. Delete Me solves these issues by assigning actual people to your account. They only have the information you give them, and they only remove it from websites you tell them to. Basically, you give them the information you don't want out there, and they continuously scan the internet to make sure that if it's there, they can file a takedown request on your behalf. No more filing requests and dealing with people yourself. Let Delete Me do it for you. If you'd like to give Delete Me a try, then you can go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE at checkout to get 20% off all US consumer plans. Once again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use code LORELODGE to get 20% off your subscription. On Sunday, June 15, 1969, a brief article entitled "Boy Lost in Park" was printed in the Knoxville News-Sentinel, informing readers that a 7-year-old boy who went on a family hike in Great Smoky Mountains National Park was believed lost Saturday night. Dennis Martin, the article continued, was reported missing near Spence Field. He and others had started a hike about 4 p.m. Park rangers and others joined in searching for him Saturday night. That was all the Park Service at the time had to offer, explaining that the boy's family was shaken, and thus the report did not say where they had come from. As it would turn out, the family had come in from Knoxville, where Dennis's father, William Martin, was an architect. The family mentioned in the article on the 15th included Dennis, his brother Doug, his grandfather Clyde, and of course his dad, William Martin. And all of them were in the park for what had become an annual Martin family Father's Day camping trip. Based on news reports from the time, it seems that these 4 Martins were not the only members of the family present on the trip, as articles refer to an Irma M. Delotsier as a cousin and a member of the hiking party. And based on some other things that are said, the implication is there that there were multiple other Martin family members there. In any case, their hike began at Cades Cove on the 13th, as the Martins took the Anthony Creek Trail south until it met the Russell Field Trail about 1.5 miles in, and then they took that Russell Field Trail another 3.5 miles until they came out at Russell Field. They camped at Russell Field the night of the 13th, and then the next morning they headed out eastward about 2.5 miles on the Appalachian Trail until they came to Spence Field. Spence Field was, at the time, a grassy area where the Anthony Creek and Eagle Creek trails meet the Appalachian Trail. This is a location that sits just under 5,000 feet in elevation, and it's where the Martin family chose to spend their second night. After settling in, William Martin, frequently referred to as Bill in both the newspapers and the documents, sat with some of the other adults, as the kids ran around amongst the bushes and trees that had begun to dot the ankle-high grassland of the former pasture. According to the National Park Service files on the case, Doug, Dennis, and 2 other children were playing near the top and parallel to the Anthony Creek trailhead, while the parents sat in a grassy spot to the southwest of the Anthony Creek trailhead. Now, it's hard to say exactly where these 2 groups of people were, due to the fact that in the last 55 years, the park has changed a little bit. Trails have been renamed, they might have moved around slightly, but the point is, these kids were never more than 300 yards away from the adults. According to the National Park Service chronological narrative of the case, sometime around 4:30 in the afternoon, Bill Martin lost sight of his sons and the 2 other boys atop the ridge, and after 3 to 5 minutes, he became concerned when Dennis failed to appear. Now, there's some confusion here regarding the papers and the reports. It's hard to tell exactly what happened, but it seems that Doug and the other 2 boys reappeared at some point, and Dennis did not. Bill called out for his younger son, and thinking that the boy may have tried to head back towards Russell Field, he walked westward along the Appalachian Trail as far as Little Bald, about 1 mile away, before he returned to Spence Field. He reportedly thought it possible that Dennis had returned to camp by this point, and while it's unclear whether Doug spoke to him before he went out to Little Bald or after that, we do know what Doug told him happened. Bill and his father Clyde had last seen the boys atop the ridge, and Doug explained to the men that all of the kids were trying to sneak around and play a trick on the grown-ups. According to the chronological narrative, Douglas and the 2 other boys went south and then west and came upon the adults, while Dennis went northwest, as it were, and intended to come upon the adults from a north to south direction. Now, that part would imply that Doug and the other boys came up before Bill went searching. Now, that document, the chronological narrative, describes Spence Field as a grassy area running east and west on the main Great Smoky Ridge, with drainages that run north into Tennessee and south into North Carolina. Now, this would suggest the boys were somewhere to the east of the aforementioned Anthony Creek Trailhead, which is now the Boat Mountain Trail, and at the time was Boat Mountain Road. If Dennis had gone northwest from that point, then the two trails he was most likely to run into were the Anthony Creek Trail and the Appalachian Trail, and these two trails lead north and west respectively. Bill and Clyde decided that the best course of action would be to split up and cover both trails at once, Bill heading west towards Russell Field, while his father headed north back towards Cades Cove. Meanwhile, unaware that there was a missing child in the area, Cades Cove seasonal naturalist Terry Chilcote and his wife were checking out the Boat Mountain Road, which was closed to cars beyond where it had a junction with the Anthony Creek Trail. The couple had driven from Laurel Creek Road to the turnaround and then hiked the 1 3/4 miles to Spence Field, arriving at 7:30 p.m., at which point people asked them if they had seen Dennis. They hadn't. However, they were able to give Bill Martin a ride back down to Laurel Creek Road, where he stayed for only about 10 minutes before a ranger named Nielsen picked him up and drove him back up to Spence Field. Why he went down in the first place is really not addressed. In any case, once they arrived back up at the campsite, it was time to interview people who'd been in the area that day. And while they had everyone from fishermen to Boy Scouts who had been on the Appalachian Trail, the Anthony Creek Trail, the Eagle Creek Trail, the Jenkins Ridge Trail, none of them had seen Dennis. As all of this was going on, though, Clyde had managed to make it back down the trail, and around 8:30 in the evening, he alerted rangers that Dennis Martin was nowhere to be found. In fact, it seems likely that the reason Nielsen was even in the position to pick Bill up is because he was probably responding to that report. While rangers on scene collected what information they could, the dispatcher was hard at work notifying other park personnel that they were all to report to the Boat Mountain Trail at 5 o'clock in the morning the next day, as recorded by Ranger Dwight McCarter. In Lost, a ranger's journal of search and rescue, McCarter wrote of that first day, during which he was assigned to a 4-man search team, which ran into problems immediately as a result of the previous night's rain. McCarter said that 2.5 inches of rain had fallen overnight, which posed both technical and logistical issues for the search effort. The narrowness of a now very muddy Boat Mountain Road created a bottleneck as trucks and jeeps attempted to get everybody up to the turnaround. And then that turnaround was still nearly 2 miles from the campsite through, again, a very muddy trail. In addition to the difficulties with getting personnel to the search area, the heavy rains also meant trouble for one of the Park Service's most useful yet finicky tools, bloodhounds. You see, a light rain can be helpful in dog searches because damp earth will hold a scent longer, but a downpour, especially on a slope, well, that's going to wash away any material carrying the scent as it flows downhill. But while the weather conditions weren't necessarily optimal for a search effort, McCarter was going to be part of an effort which would include the National Park Service Rangers and maintenance personnel, the Sevier and Blount County Rescue Squads, the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club, and a smattering of other experienced individuals. Still, McCarter wasn't exactly hopeful, journaling his belief that the rainstorm is a major complication to the search, and worrying that there is a serious risk of exposure and hypothermia for the boy. If they were going to find Dennis, it had to be done quickly, which was a true challenge given the density of the undergrowth, and the fact that, to that point, he had yet to be seen on any of the trails. However, there was always the possibility that Dennis, having wandered off into the undergrowth, could have wandered back onto a trail, and that in the interim, he simply hadn't heard anybody calling for him. Alternatively, it was possible that if he had not found a trail, he had at least found his way down into one of these drainages, and that he may have tried to follow one of the creeks. So, on that first full day of the search, volunteer teams revisited the trails on foot and on horseback, while a Ranger Phillips walked the Eagle Creek Trail, which had not been part of the previous day's effort, mostly because they felt like it was going in the wrong direction. The last time Dennis had been seen, he was on the Tennessee side of the ridge. In order for Dennis to get to the Eagle Creek Trail, it would have meant crossing back over the ridge, over the Appalachian Trail, and then going down past the actual trail shelter. In any case, as Phillips covered that side of things, 2 parties of volunteer riders covered the Anthony Creek and Leadbetter Ridge routes, today mapped as the Boat Mountain Trail and the Russell Field Trail. Also in the area was a troop of Boy Scouts who had camped at Derrick Knob the night prior, 30 of whom walked west along the Appalachian Trail, while another 8 went south down the Jenkins Ridge Trail. With the marked paths covered, the more experienced men of the National Park Service and the rescue squads took the drainages at the west prong of Little River, Anthony Creek, Little Bald, and Spence Field. If Dennis wasn't on a trail, then the next easiest path would be for him to go downhill into one of these drainages. The problem was, these drainages were covered in, again, dense undergrowth, and it would be very difficult to conduct a full search without an immense amount of manpower. Thankfully, reinforcements were arriving constantly, including about 50 rangers in training who, while they attended a junior college in Lake City, Florida, were in the area on a field trip. But more manpower came with its own set of problems, as rangers were already struggling to get men and supplies up to the search area. They needed helicopters. To that end, the chronological narrative reports that Tony Stark, the chief of resource management and visitor protection for the district they were in, was contacted and approval was obtained to hire a helicopter to transport equipment to establish a base camp at Spence Field. The Park Service then acquired the services of a local private helicopter, and further efforts resulted in the dispatch of 2 Hueys from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Macon, Georgia. If I pronounced Macon wrong, you can tell me in the comments. I will not be offended, but you guys did spell it like bacon. Along with contributions by the Air National Guard, the military was able to offer more assistance in the form of a detachment of Green Berets, or as they are more formally known, U.S. Army Special Forces. According to the Park Service, a ranger by the name of Marion Myers contacted a U.S. Forest Service District Ranger on the Nantahala, who in turn made contact with Colonel Kinney, commanding the Special Forces troops in that area. This aspect of the search is commonly referenced by those who believe that the government, in some form or another, is hiding something about the Dennis Martin case, and that actually includes us in previous videos. However, there is some relevant context here as to why the Green Berets got involved in the first place. The way this breaks down is that Kinney was running a training exercise nearby, and when contacted, he was able to obtain permission from the 3rd Army headquarters at Fort Benning in Georgia to transfer 40 Green Berets, who are typically based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, into the search area. It should probably also be noted that these forts underwent name changes in 2023, but I did not think that anybody watching this video in 2024 would recognize the names Fort Moore or Fort Liberty, partially because I sure didn't. Point is, the Green Berets were not just randomly called in from Fort Bragg, because there were 500 of them already training in the nearby Nantahala Gorge, only 17 miles to the southeast of Spence Field. It was, after all, the height of the Vietnam War, so this is not really all that surprising. All of that said, however, I do still have some thoughts on the activities of the Green Berets, but I'll get into that later. But with so much military involvement, which would actually grow to include multiple Army and Air National Guard units, a liaison was established at McGee-Tyson Air Force Base. The way this would work was that the National Park Service would run the search from the park itself, and then whenever they needed something from the military, they would contact the liaison at McGee-Tyson, and they would make sure calls were made to all of the right people. What's really impressive is that all of this was in place by Monday the 16th, at which point rescue squads were arriving from Middle Tennessee, East Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Georgia, and these were joining the Sevier County, Blount County, and North Carolina rescue squads that were already active in the area. And this sort of rush of rescue squads came after Hugh Trotter of Sevierville, the president of the Tennessee Association of Rescue Squads, met with National Park Service staff personnel and planned to organize the rescue squad effort to a larger scale. Now, to give you an idea of what a larger scale looks like, this was to be an increase from what was already some 100 persons officially listed as members of the search party that morning, according to an article written by Carson Brewer for the News-Sentinel. Also included with that article were some more details about Dennis, who was described by his father as quiet and the type who wouldn't yell for help, though Bill Martin believed his son would answer if called. In any case, by the end of the day, the search force had climbed to about 300 men consisting of National Park Service rangers, rescue squads, Air National Guard, Green Berets, volunteers, and student foresters, all of this being supported by the American Red Cross. By the time the sun rose on the morning of Tuesday the 17th, Spence Field looked more like an army encampment than a search headquarters, with the Red Cross ferrying food donations in from local restaurants, farmers, merchants, and individuals. I remember one article noted that a couple of teenage girls woke up really early one morning of the search to make 350 sandwiches that they then brought into the search area. When I looked through this, what really struck me was the way that the community came together to look for this kid. I mean, you had hundreds of people involved in the search within the first couple of days, but the overall effort involved thousands of people. There was one article where a guy who was from the Cades Cove area said something along the lines of, when one person's in trouble in the cove, we all are. That is one of the uplifting parts about reading through most of these cases, is generally when a kid goes missing, we don't see people being like, oh, that's so unfortunate. Most of the time, I'm seeing that hundreds, if not thousands of people came together to support the search. Like, when kids go missing in these stories, it's heartwarming to see how much people care, which I have to say is pretty helpful given the fact that I read about a new tragedy each week for my job. But to get back to the search and away from my little sentimental moment here, Ranger Foster led the 50 student rangers in a grid search at Spence Field, looking closely for any missed signs that might give a hint as to the direction in which Dennis had moved. On the trails, the search continued and extended out of probable areas into possible areas, the National Park Service report noting that all possibilities were checked as manpower was available. It also detailed that the Anthony Creek and other Spence Field drainages were covered and recovered as they were every day, and that another heli spot was established at Russell Field. That same morning, the 17th, 2 Air Force HH-53 Jolly Green Giant helicopters ferried an additional 50 Tennessee Air National Guardsmen to the grid search area at Spence Field because Rangers still believed Dennis was nearby. In fact, the majority of the search area here was concentrated to a 1-mile radius around where the boy was last seen. And you may be wondering how, on the third full day of the search, they could still think that Dennis was there. The answer is that this is a really dense area, and even if Dennis weren't alive, they still would rather find him than just leave him out there. Chief Ranger Lee Snedden told reporters that he felt the boy's range would not be more than a mile through the wooded area and not more than 3 miles on the trail. But Dennis's family wasn't so sure, his Aunt Irma telling reporters that the boy's got energy, plus he led the way all the time on the hike, while Bill said that Dennis was a fast walker who hardly knows when to stop. Bill thought it was most likely, according to the chronological narrative, that Dennis was somewhere in either the Anthony Creek or Eagle Creek drainages, which included the nearest creeks to where the child was last seen. There were, however, other factors that were beginning to influence Mr. Martin's beliefs, as the National Park Service files make note that the first of many predictions by individuals, clairvoyants, and others began to come in that day, Tuesday the 17th. These predictions, the document reads, played a definite part in this search and will be dealt with in an appendix to follow the narrative. As it turns out, over the course of the search, the Martins, as well as the National Park Service itself, received quite a few tips from people who referred to themselves as psychic mediums. All of these tips were considered as leads, though with varying degrees of sincerity. Mr. Martin, the chronological narrative reads, feels that some people do have the ability to see or predict things, which FBI files say resulted in almost daily contact with the Knoxville FBI office about psychic predictions. The FBI just discounted the psychic predictions out of hand, but the National Park Service felt that their hands were a little bit tied, because public opinion was that they should follow every lead possible, and according to the public, psychic tips were leads. So the Park Service had to follow up on these, but a later review of the case implies that they had something of a negative opinion on the matter. Many hours were spent to no avail in the Martin search checking out visions of seers, the review reads, adding it might be well to make a note with the family regarding such individuals. If parents do not want anything to do with psychic leads, it continues, we can send them on their way and not waste time checking out their predictions. One of the listed examples came from a rather famous psychic medium of the era, Jeanne Dixon, who in 1956 made a prediction that a Democrat would win the presidency and die in office, which of course did happen. In Dennis's case, Jeanne said the boy went out on level ground, went down an incline, and turned off to the left at a 40 to 50 degree angle and up a little, then went back down and would be underneath the point of the incline. The area where he turned left has shrubbery and is thickety. Did not see any trees where he veered off to the left, more or less bare ground. Another example was the prediction of a man named Harold Sherman, a California psychic, who said that Dennis will be found 24 miles to the left of where he was last seen by his father or brother. Fell off a steep place, hung up in the bushes. And in both this and the Dixon prediction, it seems that left refers to the cardinal direction west. Why they don't just say west, I don't know. Also, there's a stunning amount of times that I have covered cases from this area where instead of saying west, they say left. By that I mean 3. The third example came from a man named Jeffrey Owens, who was actually a local from Gatlinburg, and he said he had dreams for the last 2 nights about a lost boy. He said that in dreams he is not very far from where lost. Night before last, I saw him lying on a hill behind a log, but last night I dreamed he had dragged himself down to the river for water. The report goes on to note that there were numerous other predictions, and the family was most receptive to these. However, none of these leads actually turned up any actionable info about Dennis, which isn't particularly surprising when you dig into them. Jeanne's prediction mostly just gave information that was already published in the papers, such as Dennis being on level ground, turning left at a 40 to 50 degree angle, or in his case going northwest, and going down an incline. It had been reported for several days that Dennis got lost on top of a ridge. There was really the only option was to go down. From where he disappeared, the remainder of her description would apply to basically any spot along the Appalachian Trail for miles in either direction, and for most trails nearby. Harold Sherman's prediction that he was 24 miles to the left, again if we assume he meant west, would put Dennis outside the park and possibly across the Little Tennessee River. Even if Dennis were still in the park and somehow 24 miles west, maybe along trails, or I mean if we're just talking about foot miles where he actually walked, which again he wasn't on the trails, so it's a little difficult to use now, isn't it? Anyway, the point is that the description of fell off a steep place, hung up in the bushes, is utterly useless considering the number of ridges and bushes in the park. In the case of Mr. Owens, we see much the same issue that we have with the preceding two, which is that it's just too vague to be useful. Saying that Dennis was lying on a hill behind a log one night and that he had dragged himself down to the river wasn't helpful because the searchers had already been checking drainages, so if he was down at the river or the side of the creek, he should have been found. The specifics of the other psychic recommendations aren't given in any of the National Park Service reports, but they do emphasize that all leads were checked and rechecked to no avail. Honestly, checked and rechecked to no avail should be the slogan for this entire case, as that's essentially what happened over the next 2 weeks as more searchers, supplies, and helicopters joined the effort, only to find nothing. The search effort was expanding day by day, those involved moving farther and farther away from the point where Dennis was last seen. Except for the Green Berets, who kind of stayed in the same general area the entire time that they were there. Beginning their first full day on the search, Tuesday the 17th, Special Forces were assigned to the Eagle Creek and Jenkins Ridge Trail area, which had been searched for the first time on Sunday the 15th by Ranger Phillips. On the 17th, the News-Sentinel reported, searchers found small footprints which could be those of Dennis Martin. The article, published on the 18th, reports that a search party which included James Harmon and Ronald Lauder, probably, found the set of prints yesterday afternoon about a mile down the Eagle Creek area from Spence Field. Speaking to the Tennessean, Harmon said that they found footprints, one shoe on and one shoe off, about 2:30 in the afternoon, but lost them in a branch that feeds into Eagle Creek after about 300 yards. Park officials reportedly didn't pay this discovery much mind because a number of Boy Scouts had been in that area, and they believed that the prints could easily just belong to one of them. Thing is, Lauder said that it was a single set of footprints headed downstream. What's more interesting to me than the Park Service reportedly not taking an interest is the fact that the prints actually don't appear in the chronological narrative at all. And that's especially weird for a couple of reasons, one of which is that this print discovery was reported multiple times, for like 3 days in a row, and at no point did the Park Service correct them and say, no, there weren't actually prints found. The Park Service just kind of let them report that, and then didn't report it themselves. The other reason it's a little weird is that that's not even the first set of tracks reported by the papers. Articles published on the 17th in both the Tennessean and the News-Sentinel mentioned that tracks were found Monday afternoon, prior to the arrival of the Green Berets. These tracks failed to produce the boy, according to the Tennessean, while the other paper claimed that the prints proved to be the wrong size for the boy. But neither paper says where the tracks were. While I can't say for certain, I do wonder if Harmon and Lauder found the tracks Monday, but shoddy reporting made it seem like they found them Tuesday. And this is partially due to the fact that we know Special Forces were in the area on Tuesday, according to the chronological narrative, If there were special forces there, you would assume then that the volunteers would not be in the area. It's all a little weird, though obviously there's no smoking gun here. But it is weird enough to take a closer look at the actions of the Green Berets and the National Park Service over the next several days. As the Park Service apparently downplayed the prints, Special Forces A teams continued to check the Eagle Creek area on the 18th, with nearly 24 additional Green Berets brought in that day, for a total of 62. This brought the total search force to 615 people, which now also included students from the University of Tennessee's forestry program, as well as both Air and Army National Guard units. What's interesting is that while 90% of the search force were exploring progressively wider ranges of the park, mostly to the east and west along the Appalachian Trail, the Green Berets were just looking in a very specific area. On the 17th, they were deployed to Eagle Creek, where those tracks were found, and then they returned to that same location the following day. On the 19th, the chronological narrative reports that they began to concentrate on an area between Forester Ridge and Jenkins Trail below Hog Gap, on the other side of a ridge from and southeast of Eagle Creek. Now, I have no proof that they were doing this, but it does kind of seem like they were following some kind of trail up Eagle Creek, over Hog Gap, and then down into the Hog Gap branch area, which is part of a drainage that leads into Hazel Creek. And this also happened to coincide with the advice of a psychic out of Michigan by the name of Mrs. Schwaller, who said that Dennis would be found 5 miles southeast from the area where he was last seen, and that he would be on a stream by a waterfall and in an area covered by white pine trees. That could have been a lucky guess, as along a stream in an area with white pines would describe a lot of places in the Smokies, but the 5 miles southeast is interesting. The reason it's interesting is that the location in which the Green Berets were searching on the 19th had not yet been made public by the time this tip was submitted. And this was a tip that would put Dennis either along the Bone Valley Creek or Hog Gap Branch. Still, there is the issue of her predicting there would be a waterfall, because there are no waterfalls mapped along that waterway. So in this case, I'm still gonna err on the side of random chance. Now, what wasn't random chance, at least so far as I can tell, was the decision by Special Forces to set up a helicopter landing zone atop Hog Gap on the 20th, especially in light of what occurred that night. Around 8 p.m. on the evening of Friday, the 20th of June, 1969, the Green Berets met with National Park Service personnel for a strategy meeting, in which they formulated 2 plans based upon whether Dennis was found alive or not. The first step, of course, would be to determine if Dennis was alive, with the criteria being that he was only dead if rigor mortis has set in, which seems weird, but at the same time, they could have been worried about hypothermia mimicking death. From there, they were to notify the Chief Ranger by the most expeditious means possible with the location and status of the boy. They were then to climb a tree and set a flag, build a smudge fire, use a smoke bomb, military only, or use another signal for a helicopter, and if Dennis was found alive, they were instructed to stand by while Special Forces rappel a man in by helicopter and secure the boy in a litter, or, should the worst come to pass, they were to guard the area until they were relieved by Chief Ranger Sneddon. Finally, they were ordered to obtain the name and address of whoever found Dennis, presumably so that person could be interviewed, whether they were a National Park, Green Beret, or just a volunteer. Now, the way all of that reads, it sounds almost like they were expecting to find Dennis within the next couple of days, and that they expected whoever was going to find the boy to be either a park ranger or a Green Beret. And all of that put together would suggest that they expected to find Dennis off-trail. This is all made even more interesting by the fact that in the National Park Service chronological narrative, the 21st is the very first time that the actions of the Green Berets are not detailed, for the first time since they arrived in the park. Instead, we're informed that a roadblock was set up at the Townsend Y at 5 a.m. The Y is not a YMCA, it's a geographical Y, with Blount County Sheriff's deputies and rescue squad personnel assisting, and the intention being to keep the area clear of non-approved onlookers. We're also told that rangers screened searchers and loaded those approved onto buses, and after all the high spots were perfectly staffed, the remaining searchers were directed to the drainages and ridges along Anthony Creek, All Night Ridge, Leadbetter Ridge, and the immediate drainages into Cades Cove. And with some 1,400 searchers out that day, They completely saturated a 1-mile radius around Spence Field and all immediate logical ridge tops. Finally, the report states that all local drainages had been covered 250 feet up on each side of the streams, and the farthest this would have taken any volunteer was Eagle Creek. And most volunteers were on the Tennessee side anyway, well away from special forces. And then the 22nd came and went without any mention of the activities of the Green Berets, aside from the addition of another 9 members of the elite military unit, bringing the total to 71 commandos. Whatever their reason for bringing in more Green Berets was, it's not recorded in any of the files for that day. Nor are their actions in the reports for the 23rd or the 24th, which is the day that FBI agent Jim Reich came in for a conference. What the outcome of that meeting was is not recorded, nor was anything about the Green Berets aside from their departure, which spanned the 25th and the 26th in groups of 33 and 38 respectively. The 25th was also the day that Park Superintendent Fry issued a press release stating that the operation will be greatly reduced as of June 26, 1969, and that the 75 National Park Service personnel now on the search will continue through Sunday. If the boy is not found by this time, the report continues, the search will continue on a limited basis for up to 60 days. All Tennessee Army National Guard troops will leave today. Somewhat predictably, this decision was not received well by the Martin family, and in particular, Bill Martin, who was of the mind that his son was not just lost, but had in fact been kidnapped. The search, of course, continued a few more days, and then on the evening of the 29th, a meeting was held at the Cades Cove Operations Center with Mr. and Mrs. William Martin, FBI agent Jim Reich, Chief Ranger Snedden, District Ranger Morris, and Sub-District Ranger Nielsen to discuss where to go from that point. Reich apparently argued that, absent evidence of a kidnapping, the FBI could not launch a full investigation into the whereabouts of Dennis Martin. Bill, on the other hand, felt that the short time between the last time he saw Dennis and when they began looking, and the fact that Dennis was not found near Spence Field, indicated he didn't just wander off. In essence, while there was no evidence of a kidnapping, the existing evidence didn't support the notion that Dennis could have just left the area that quickly either. Nonetheless, the FBI said they had no reason to get involved, and the National Park Service was only willing to offer 3 rangers on a search for the next 60 days, though those rangers would be able and willing to coordinate volunteers. With that, the search was suspended on the evening of the 29th, with no trace of Dennis Martin ever reportedly found. However, less than a month later, a very strange report appeared in the papers, coming from a Mr. Harold Key. To go over that side of things, I decided to bring in a man who is much better versed in that aspect of this case than I am, and a man who deserves a lot more recognition for the incredible work that he does over on his channel, The Missing Enigma.
Hey there, folks. You might recognize me, but maybe you don't. I'm Nick from the Missing Enigma channel. I've spent a lot of time working on the Dennis Martin case and have released a lot of videos on the subject, so I want to thank the Lore Lodge for allowing me to do this segment discussing an important figure, Michael Bouchard, a man I've spent many hours talking to about the Martin case. Now, Mike wasn't directly involved in the search or anything. He is an author and a police officer from Connecticut who likes to spend his free time investigating and writing about cold cases. His work has really added a lot to our current understanding of the Dennis Martin case. I was fortunate enough to run into his name after hearing him mentioned by Dwight McCarter, another important Dennis Martin figure. After looking Bouchard up, I discovered he had written a book about this thick called The Disappearance of Dennis Martin, which compiled a multi-year investigation into the incident. That book was released back in 2021, but he's a self-published man who doesn't really advertise his work, so the importance of that little book didn't disseminate right away. At that point, my own perspective on the Dennis Martin case had changed dramatically by reading the official NPS report, but after reading Bouchard's book, it changed again. Why? Because it gives clarity to what had been one of the most mysterious and pivotal events during the Martin disappearance, that being the Harold Key sighting. Now, up until the point that Bouchard published his book, the Key sighting was believed by most people to have gone something like this. Harold Key and his family stop by Rowan's Creek and walk out into the woods in hopes of seeing a bear. After walking a ways, they heard an enormous, sickening scream. A few minutes later, Mr. Key saw a rough-looking man moving stealthily through the woods in an area where the scream was heard. This sighting would get expanded upon with the release of Missing 411 in 2011, where author David Paulides writes that Dennis Martin's father told him that the man Mr. Key saw in the woods was a dark figure running along a ridgeline and carrying something on his shoulder. Naturally, people interpreted that the figure may have been carrying young Dennis. Sprinkle in some legends of wild men in the Smokies, and you get Dennis Martin being abducted by a wild man, or in some cases even Bigfoot. The problem with this whole interpretation of the sighting is that there was no modern-day interview with Mr. Key, the man whose sighting was so pivotal. I mean, he was the one who was there, so it seems like he would be the most important individual to talk to about what he saw that day. Thankfully, that is what Michael Bouchard gave us when he interviewed Harold Key on July 27th of 2016. Up until that point, Harold Key had not spoken about the case since he was initially interviewed back in 1969, and obviously since that time, the Dennis Martin story had really developed a lot of legend or mythology around it. Mr. Key told Michael Bouchard that he took his family out to Rowan's Creek to look for some wild hogs or bears. He couldn't remember the exact time of the incident, but believed it was somewhere between 2 and 7 p.m. Before walking out into the woods, he noticed an unoccupied white vehicle parked along the road. At the time, he paid little attention to it. He then walked about 200 to 300 yards into the woods and saw a white, middle-aged man that was dirty and disheveled and walking quickly through the brush towards the road. When the man saw Mr. Key and his family, he started to walk faster. Mr. Key told Bouchard that the man was sweating heavily and acting nervous. The man made it to the road, entered the white vehicle, and drove off at a high rate of speed, spitting gravel into the air. Mr. Key was directly quoted saying, "I only saw one man in the woods, the man who walked out of the woods and got into the white car." As Mr. Key continued on towards Rowan's Creek, he heard a child scream the word help, and then he heard an agonizing scream of pain. Mr. Key then hurried up the path another 200 yards, but he didn't see a child. To him, it seemed that the scream had come from a great distance, but he could not pinpoint the exact location. Harold Key's daughter, Wanda Key Grandstaff, was present for the event, and she was also interviewed by Michael Bouchard. She took issue with the idea that her father ever saw a man in the woods carrying a child. She said her father was a World War II vet, and if he saw someone hurting a child, he would go after the man. The idea that people believed her father saw someone carrying a child and simply did nothing seemed to really irritate her. She had also seen newspapers saying that her brothers were out walking ahead of their father and saw something, but she wanted to correct that record as well, saying that neither boy saw anyone, and they were all walking behind Mr. Key looking for rocks and sticks along the trail. One of her brothers did hear the scream, but couldn't tell if it was an animal or a child. After this experience, the family left the park and went back home, but Harold Key didn't make the connection in his head until he learned of the disappearance of Dennis Martin. At that point, he realized what he had seen may have some bearing on the case. He got in touch with authorities and was interviewed at his home by FBI agents Jim Reich and Wallace Estell. The agents told Mr. Key to not talk about the incident with anyone. This is relevant because Mr. Key did talk about it. He talked to reporters, and those interviews were published. Mr. Key reported to Bouchard that one night he received an anonymous phone call at home, and the person on the other line said, "It's none of your damn business about the missing boy, and don't talk about it." Something quite similar to what the FBI agents told him. Mr. Key would provide a second interview to the FBI, this time on location at Rowan's Creek. He was intercepted by the FBI on the way to that location and then taken there, a story that is sometimes blown out of proportion. Dennis Martin's father, Bill, was not invited to attend this important meeting where Mr. Key showed the FBI and the MPS exactly what he saw and where he saw it. This meeting was later documented and released in the FBI files. 2 years after the Dennis Martin disappearance, Harold Key received another anonymous phone call. This time, the person on the other line said, "The case is closed. Forget what you've heard." After that, Mr. Key didn't talk about the incident again until he spoke with Michael Bouchard in 2016. And he said the only reason he was willing to talk about the incident then was because most of the people involved in the investigation, including both FBI agents, were already dead. Mr. Key himself was 92 years old and figured there was nothing they could do to him at that point, and he's not wrong. When asked about his thoughts on the Dennis Martin disappearance, Mr. Key said that at the bottom of his heart, he believed that the boy was killed and his body was disposed of in the woods. So that is the full story of Harold Key's sighting as told by the man himself. I'm sure that some people who've heard the story told differently might say, well, why should I believe this Bouchard guy? It's a fair question to ask, and I felt similarly, but I've interviewed the man twice on my channel and have talked to him for countless hours on the phone. He engrossed himself in this case. He knows everything about the incident down to the smallest detail. I've found him to be reliable, thorough, and trustworthy. But, in addition to all that, I did find contemporary newspaper articles that confirm much of what Mr. Key told Bouchard. These articles contain interviews with Mr. Key where he specifically mentions the man and the white car. No interview with Mr. Key, either modern or contemporary, ever has him on record saying that the man he saw was carrying anything on his shoulder. And beyond the Harold Key interview, Bouchard was able to put additional myths to bed, one important one being the death of FBI agent Jim Reich. The myth about Jim Reich was that he was so distressed about what he had seen or learned as it relates to the Dennis Martin case that he decided to end his own life. The latter part of that is true, but there is no evidence that he took that action due to the Dennis Martin case. Bouchard spoke with Jim Reich's son and quickly discovered that Dennis Martin had nothing to do with it. Like many people, Jim Reich had issues with mental health and substance abuse. In addition to that, Jim Reich was only one of 2 FBI agents involved in the Martin disappearance. The other, Wallace Estell, would retire and go on living his life. So, like many mysteries in the world, over time, our understanding of them changes as new information comes out. With Dennis Martin, so much was written when it occurred back in 1969. It was a huge story, but over time it faded out of the public consciousness. It was revived once again when Missing 411 the Eastern U.S. was released back in 2011. With this came a story from Bill Martin saying that he spoke to Harold Key and Mr. Key told him he saw a man in the woods carrying something on his shoulder. This key point, among many others, would contribute to the Dennis Martin case becoming a well-known mystery and disappearance. Then, in 2021, Michael Bouchard releases his book and interview with Harold Key himself, where he clarifies the inaccuracies that had been told about his story for so many years. I think this information certainly helped correct the record, as there is absolutely no documented interview with Mr. Key where he says he saw a man carrying a child or anything at all. Some rightly ask, why then would Bill Martin tell such a story to David Paulides? Obviously, I can't answer this definitively, but sometimes the disappearance of a child can have such a detrimental effect on a parent or a family member that they will create any scenario in their minds that allows for their child to still be alive. This, in turn, can sometimes keep hope alive. Hope that their child is still out there somewhere, living some kind of life. But that is just my theory on the subject. Ultimately, I really only care about the interviews Harold Key did, which were back in 1969 and then again in 2016 with Michael Bouchard. It really is lucky because Mr. Key would pass away just a few years later. So that's the story of Michael Bouchard and his involvement in the Dennis Martin case. Thanks to his investigative work, we have new information to work with as we all attempt to create ideas and theories about what could have happened on that fateful day back in June of 1969. Now, I'll thank you for listening and throw it back to Aiden.
Speaking of theories, I mentioned that I have some thoughts on what was going on with the Green Berets, and I think that now might be the time to share them. You know, when I first heard about Missing 411, I believe it came through Mr. Ballin, and the story that really got me intrigued was this one. It was the Dennis Martin disappearance, which I think we've actually, in various ways, covered 3 different times now. The reason it was so interesting to me, however, was the Green Beret involvement. And at first, it was the fact that there were Green Berets involved at all, because it's a pretty elite military unit. Why are you calling them in for a missing 7-year-old? Of course, the fact that they were just training nearby kind of explains that part. When I covered it a second time, I was intrigued by the fact that the Green Berets seemed to be working separately from the National Park Service, because they weren't using the same communications, they weren't involved in the same areas of the search. But as I thought about it more, and as some people wrote suggestions in the comments, it made sense that they are a special forces group, they have their own way of doing things, and maybe they just didn't gel with the way the Park Service was handling things. But upon reviewing the case a third time, it still strikes me as odd that the Green Berets were operating in this very limited area with what appeared to be some intention. It wasn't just that they wouldn't be useful anywhere else. These guys work in teams of 10 to 12. Those teams of 10 to 12 are totally self-sufficient on their own, and they could have been distributed all over the park. So why have all of them in one spot? And the truth is, it wouldn't really feel like anything if not for the footprints, and how weird the Park Service was about the footprints. And while this is reported in the newspapers, it's not in the actual chronological narrative. And that, again, I would just assume the newspapers made an oopsie if it hadn't then been reiterated in the newspapers for several days with no correction. And then we have the fact that these footprints that were apparently nothing to think about are the starting point of the Green Berets moving eastward along these ridges and then down into the Haw Gap Branch. So when I look at it, it really does look to me like those footprints were found and the Green Berets were the guys assigned to follow them. That could be entirely not the case. I can't prove that. I don't think that it's... There is no way for me to prove that, ever. Basically, the only way this could be proven is if you could find the orders to the Green Berets there that are saying, hey, follow the footprints. But of course, it was never reported that Dennis Martin was found. In fact, precisely the opposite was reported. Even though these Green Berets just go this direction, make a plan for what to do when they find Dennis, and then suddenly disappear. And then we're just told a few days later, he was never found. So maybe he wasn't found, but in that case, what were the Green Berets following? What were they tracking? How did they end up over there? I don't want to sound like David Politis and imply to you that this is Bigfoot or feral people or something like that, but it's weird. But the thing is, that's not the only thing about this case that's weird, and it's not necessarily connected to the other things that are weird. I mean, as Nick said, Harold Key got weird calls months and then years after he reported what he saw, telling him, the case is closed, drop it, don't talk about it. We also know that the FBI did open an investigation into Dennis Martin, and that a couple of years later, that case was closed with really no information made public. And to be honest, as I was doing the research for this, it became very clear to me that I was not going to be able to get through all of the theories, all the conspiracies, all that stuff in this video, or more realistically in the week that I had to research and write this video. So to that end, there's going to be a part 2, and the part 2, much like what we did with Dyatlov Pass and with MH370, things like that, is going to go into the conspiracy theories and the evidence for and against each of them. But of course, I need several more days to put that together, so that one will be coming out after this one. If you're watching this the Friday it premiered, then this will be a week later. If you're watching this anytime after Friday, August 23rd, 2024, then the second video is already up. So it's just part 2. It should be up. Go find it. It might be in the description. I don't know if I remember. But with all of that said, I first of all want to thank Nick for his contribution to this video, because I definitely didn't have time to write that part myself, and he did a better job than I would have. Nick's channel, The Missing Enigma, has so much good work on it. The man is not only a great storyteller, but he's also a fantastic researcher, and he makes some really incredible drawings to go along with his cases. We've had him on our channel as a guest on the podcast numerous times. He has always made me think. He has, in fact, changed my mind on the Charles McCullers disappearance. So I cannot recommend Nick's channel highly enough. The Missing Enigma is one of my favorite channels on YouTube, and you guys, if you like what we do, you will absolutely love what he does too. So if you'd like to support him, obviously go watch his videos, help the man get to a point where he can go full-time with YouTube. And if you want to support us, as we are currently full-time here on YouTube, you can subscribe to this channel, of course. You can share the video, you can hit that like button if you liked the video. If you didn't like the video, I'm surprised you're still here, but you know, I get it. Or if you want to support us in a more direct way, we have a few ways you can do that. First of all, you should follow us on Discord. You should join our Discord where we give updates for everything. That is bit.ly/jointhelodge. That will get you to a link to join. After you do that, then the other ways you can support us are to go to Patreon and subscribe for just $1 a month. There are some goodies over there, some exclusive shows. We are posting all of our notes monthly over to Patreon, so you can see the notes, the script, all of that. We're a little behind on it, but we're getting there. All of those perks also come with the YouTube membership, and again, you can get that for just $1 here. If every single person who subscribed to this channel, honestly, if every single person who watched this video in the first 24 hours became a $1 Patreon subscriber, we could start doing full-scale documentaries on location tomorrow. If you'd like to do something that will support us while giving you something physical, something material, well, the higher Patreon tiers do that while YouTube doesn't. But more importantly, you can go to bunkerbranding.com and you can wear the lodge. Right now I've got the Lift Lodge. This is a redesigned, thicker antlered version of a shirt we made a couple of years ago. We also have a couple of new designs. Those are the Redacted Media and the new Lore Lodge logo. They're very pretty, they're very nice. And these things are so comfortable, and the printing is all done in the United States. I love this brand. You can also drink the lodge by going to tableauroastingco.com and clicking the collaborations link in the menu. There you will see that there is a Lore Lodge coffee called Mount Pocono Perk. You might also see a Stakuyi coffee or a History of Everything coffee called Lewis and Dark. They're both delicious. I drink mine every day, and I actually have a couple of bags of Stakuyis for when I want to make something. His is really good for making like a mocha. I do always have to add into this little bit, I didn't pick this coffee off a shelf. I worked in an artisan roastery for many years, and I spoke to Matt Moore, the man who owns Tableau, and I said, I want these beans. And he gave me those beans, and now I give you those beans. You can also get more Lodge by going to our other channels, of which there are many, like at the Aiden Mattis, where I stream. We also have the Lore Lounge, which we're gonna start streaming on. And then there's the Weird Bible, which we need to stream more on. And then there's the History Hut, which might be getting a podcast soon. We also have a couple of other active channels. Those are Off the Record with Luke Eccles and Boozy Mixologist. Those channels both have their own podcasts, and we are trying to grow them so that we can have, you know, a whole network going, a whole network of Lodge. You know, we have this building, now we need to fill it. And last but of course not least, we do a live show on Monday nights at 7 p.m. Now that is changing. 7 p.m. Eastern, you can catch Aiden and I having conversations about these cases live, bringing on guests, talking about everything from the paranormal to history to unsolved mysteries. You know, it's a fun time. We enjoy it. We sometimes even do debates. Well, that is everything. Without much ado, I'm Aiden Mattis, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.